Thank you for joining us this morning. I'll call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. We are now beginning our public review of the report of the Auditor General of Canada, the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly 2018 Independent Auditors Report, Child and Family Services Department of Health and Social Services and Social Services Authorities in the Northwest Territories. And I'll ask members to introduce themselves for the record, and we'll start with Mr. Blake.
Good morning, Frederick Blake, MLA for Mackenzie Delta.
Good morning again, welcome, Herb Nakamak from the Nukput.
Good morning, welcome, Shane Thompson to Henday.
Welcome, Corey Van Thorn, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Good morning, Danny McNeely, Satu Region.
Good morning, Michael Nadley, MLA for Tlicho.
Good morning, Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Good morning, RJ Simpson, MLA for Hay River North.
And I'm Terrance, member for Kent Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. With me at the table, our committee clerk, Jennifer Frankie Smith, and our committee research advisor, Ms. Megan Welsh. I would like to welcome Mr. Terrance DeJong and officials from the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. Mr. DeJong, please introduce yourself and your officials for the record.
Good morning. I'm Terrance DeJong, Assistant Auditor General of Canada. I'm joined by Glenn Wheeler, the principal responsible for this audit, and Erin Jellinek, the director responsible for this audit.
Thank you, Mr. DeJong. I understand this is the last appearance of Ms. Jellinek before this committee. She has worked on a number of audits, 6, I'm told, of the government of the Northwest Territories. She's a very familiar face to many public servants and to members of this committee and members of our predecessor committees who work for the GNWT and the Legislative Assembly. The committee has benefited greatly from your knowledge and insight. On behalf of my colleagues here, I want to wish Ms. Jellinek the very best future in her travels and future endeavors. Thank you very much for your service over the years. Before I turn the floor over to Mr. DeJong, I want to take a few moments to set the stage for today's discussions. This is the second audit of Child and Family Services by the Office of the Auditor General. The first one was completed in March of 2014. Once again, the Auditor General's report has generated great public interest. Child welfare touches on issues of social justice, poverty, physical and mental health, education, the legacy of residential schools, and our responsibilities to actively pursue reconciliation. It is something that personally impacts many, many Northerners. Not only has there been significant media coverage in the Northwest Territories and across the country, but we also know that child welfare is part of a much larger conversation in our northern communities. With that in mind, I want to address the purpose of today's hearing and bring some clarity to our goals as a standing committee. The Auditor General's report speaks only to the performance of the Department of Health and Social Services and the regional health authorities. It is the role of this standing committee to analyze and report on the findings of the Auditor General as it relates to the government of the Northwest Territories' performance and to make recommendations additional to those of the Auditor General that will bring practical improvements to the lives of children and family engaged within the system. As many of you are aware, work to improve child and family services in the Northwest Territories has a long history. Our predecessors in the earlier assemblies repeatedly urged system improvements, policy changes, enhanced staffing, and changes to our legislation. In response to the first audit of child and family services, the Standing Committee on Government Operations in the 17th Assembly produced a report containing 30 recommendations for change. In the 18th Assembly, our colleagues on the Standing Committee on Social Development have closely monitored departmental performance in this portfolio. Now we're meeting today to examine the follow-up audit to the one done in 2014. The Auditor General has made a number of recommendations, and the Department of Health and Social Services has accepted all of them. Following today's meetings with the Auditor General's staff and with departmental officials, the Standing Committee on Government Operations will table its own report early in 2019. In this report, we will make our own recommendations to the government. I want to assure members of the public with us here today and watching online that we take these matters very seriously. It is our job to hold the government of the Northwest Territories to account in its legal and moral responsibilities to the children in its care. We have already received some comments from members of the public. Although today's lengthy proceedings do not allow time for presentations from the public, we have received correspondence from a number of individuals and organizations, including the Status of Women Council of the Northwest Territories, the Native Women's Society, and certain individuals with expertise in the area of childcare and social work. I want to assure all interested parties that the committee will give consideration to any written input we receive, and it will form part of the public record in the committee's written report. With that said, we'll just go over a few housekeeping matters before going to the formal hearing. For the interest of anyone who has lunch plans, our plan is to hear from the Auditor General this morning, and then to take a break for lunch, and then hear from the Deputy Minister of Health and Social Services, Mr. Bruce Cooper, and his witnesses at 1 p.m. I understand that Mr. DeJong will make himself available to the media before he leaves Yellowknife to answer any questions that they may have. If there are any questions, they can be asked either outside this committee room or in the Great Hall. Finally, in today's proceedings, we will follow the rules of the Legislative Assembly as far as they relate to standing committee hearings. Members will be allowed 10 minutes of time to ask questions of witnesses, and we will follow the procedural rules present in Committee of the Whole. I will now turn the floor over to Mr. DeJong to make any opening remarks. Mr. DeJong.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to discuss our report on child and family services in the Northwest Territories. The report was tabled in the Legislative Assembly on October 23, 2018. I'm here today on behalf of the Auditor General of Canada, Michael Ferguson. Joining me, as previously mentioned, are Glenn Wheeler and Erin Jellinek, who are members of the audit team. In this audit, we examined whether both the Department of Health and Social Services and the Health and Social Services authorities met key responsibilities for the protection and well-being of children, youth, and their families. We audited this same area in 2014, and the problems we found then were of sufficient concern that we knew we would have to re-examine the important services provided to vulnerable children and families. More than 4 years later, in our 2018 audit, we determined that many of the services that we examined were in fact worse than when we examined them in 2014. For example, we found that the management of health and social services authorities and the monitoring of plan of care agreements were much worse than in 2014. Plan of care agreements set out the conditions that parents of at-risk children must meet to ensure the safety of the children in their care, such as maintaining sobriety or attending counseling. In almost 90% of the cases we reviewed, the authorities were not monitoring agreements as required. What monitoring they did focused mostly on the parents, not on the children that the plans were intended to protect. The authorities did not interview children as often as the plans required to make sure the children were safe and to assess their health and well-being. The authorities also did not regularly contact almost 90% of the children they had removed from the care of their parents and placed in foster care or other placements, compared with just under 60% in our 2014 audit. This left the authorities with no way of knowing whether the children were receiving the care they needed. Our audit work also revealed the emergence of a concerning approach for placing children who were under the care of the Director of Child and Family Services. We found that authorities placed 14 out of 22 children with permanent guardians without performing basic checks on those guardians, such as a home study or criminal record check, to ensure that these children were being placed in safe and appropriate homes. Screening prospective guardians is important because once a guardianship agreement is in place, the Director of Child and Family Services no longer has the authority to monitor or oversee the child. Senior department and authority officials told us they were unaware that this practice was occurring. We also found that the required supervision and monitoring was in place for only about 1 in 5 children in the Director's care who were placed in treatment facilities outside the Northwest Territories. Approximately 40 to 50 children and youth with specific and often complex needs are placed in treatment facilities outside the Territory each year. These children and youth are a long way from home and need supervision to oversee their care and help ensure their safety. In one case we reviewed, a child ran away from a care facility multiple times and at one point was missing for over a week. During that time, it was unclear who was responsible for ensuring the child was found and safely returned. We also found that serious deficiencies persisted in foster care. the Health and Social Services authorities did not adequately screen the majority of foster homes before placing children. They also did not conduct annual reviews of these homes to ensure that children were well cared for. Our audit also examined the structures in place to support the delivery of child and family services. We found that issues with accountability, which we raised in 2014, were unresolved. For example, although the Department of Health and Social Services had since appointed assistant directors under the Child and Family Services Act, many of them did not have qualifications or experience in child and family services. Although the department provided these assistant directors with training and oversight, it was insufficient preparation for fulfilling their key responsibilities for the services provided to children and families. Since our 2014 audit, the department has focused much of its attention on changing its processes, which serve to introduce complex changes into an already overburdened system. For example, the department rolled out a new decision-making system, but did not fully train child protection workers to use it. As a result, a system intended to help these workers assess child safety could well end up putting children at greater risk if it is used incorrectly and leads to a wrong decision about a child's protection needs. The department's own review of the tool's use did in fact find concerning problems, such as decisions to screen out calls about child protection that should have been investigated. This could have left children in unsafe situations. It's very important to acknowledge that child and family services is a difficult and sensitive area in which to work. Child protection workers deal with many serious issues facing children and families and must make difficult decisions daily. We met many dedicated and committed child protection workers across the territory during the course of our audit. And yet, we found that despite multiple commitments to do so, the department still had not assessed whether the financial and human resource levels it allocated to the authorities were enough to deliver the required services for children and families. It started to assess what was needed only toward the end of our audit period. As an organization, we were deeply concerned by the findings in this audit. The Auditor General has personally expressed to me his disappointment with the results we found. The department and the authorities must start working on how they will achieve their common objective of providing better services and achieving better outcomes for children, youth, and families. Children will remain at risk until the department and the authorities make the changes that they said were critical and that they committed to making. We made 11 recommendations to help the Department of Health and Social Services and the Health and Social Services authorities improve child and family services. Both have agreed to implement our recommendations. Further, we noted that after the audit period, the department made several commitments to take timely and effective action to address concerning deficiencies in the delivery of child and family services, and to recruit and retain more child protection workers to deliver these services. Mr. Chair, given that the focus is vulnerable children and families, and that this is the second time we found significant problems with services meant to protect and support them, we encourage the committee to ask the department for details on how it intends to uphold these commitments and make immediate improvements. We also encourage the committee to seek ongoing updates from the department, not only on the implementation of these commitments, but also on whether they are resulting in concrete improvements in services for children and families. This concludes my opening statement. We would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. DeJong. Committee? Are there any questions for our witnesses? Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my first question is, you know, in 2014 we had this, the audit was done, and in 2018 we narrowed it. And you know, we hear from the department and we hear from people saying, well, look all the good work we did in 2014 as we move forward. So could, I guess, the audit team, if you could explain to us why this scope was changed as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler?
Mr. Chair, in 2014, the first time we audited Child and Family Services, we started by taking a look at the system in its entirety, and we made some quite significant observations about weaknesses in accountability and how services were structured. The second part of that audit then went and looked at a selection of files for children in care and children requiring protection, and we found quite significant shortcomings in terms of children not receiving the services that they were entitled to under the legislation and under the department's standards and procedures manual. In coming back and doing the follow-up in 2018, the office, the Auditor General specifically, was quite clear that given the seriousness of the findings in 2014, it would be incumbent for us to look and see, first and foremost, whether services had improved to children and families on the ground. So for an example of that would be in 2014, we found that there hadn't been a proper screening of a lot of foster care homes. So had that improved? So we quite intentionally went right to the results to see whether the system had improved. And as the audit set out, along many of the key services that the department and the authorities are responsible for providing, services had actually worsened. So this time around, we focused on the results first, then we took a step back and asked some of the questions as to why that was the case. And we speak to in the audit report about issues related to the reorganization of Child and Family Services, the creation of the new Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority, the introduction of the strategic decision-making model, and for example in that area where the model was introduced and yet we found there might not have been, or there wasn't enough training provided to child protection workers on the ground in order to determine how to properly use that system. So I guess the short answer to your question is that it was a deliberate decision on our part to focus on results. You have to keep in mind, or one has to keep in mind, that in this area we're talking about children, vulnerable children and families, and it's of paramount importance that those children and those families at risk get the services that they require. Mr. Chair?
Mr. Thompson.
Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for that explanation. I greatly appreciate it. I know in the past, and I'm looking at, other jurisdictions after we've come up with this, this audit came for us and we've seen the results. And I guess my big thing is that if we had one child in the system that we fail, that's not good enough. When we did this audit, and have you looked at other jurisdictions and, best practices as an opportunity to enhance what our system is presently? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, I think one of the important things that's important to keep in mind when we do audits of this nature is that we audit a system or a jurisdiction on the legislation and the standards and the procedures that are in place in that jurisdiction. So, for example, in the Northwest Territories, the requirement is that children be assessed when there's an identification of a potential issue for a child needing protection within a specific period of time. That might differ from another jurisdiction. Each jurisdiction has its own legislation and own unique requirements. So we audit the Northwest Territories based on the legislation and the standards and procedures that are in place here. And it's a very, Child and Family Services is a complex area across all jurisdictions in Canada. And I think if you spoke to other audit offices, they would say that there are shortcomings in their jurisdictions. There probably are jurisdictions that are doing some aspects of Child and Family Services better than others. But as auditors, again, we audit what's required in the jurisdiction we're auditing. And if we were to speak to a practice in another jurisdiction, we would have to have the assurance that it's actually robust and working in a way that's intended. And unless we would actually do audit work in that area, we wouldn't have that assurance. So for that reason, we stay, within the jurisdiction that we're auditing. And I would just take the opportunity to go back to the first question that you asked, and you asked why our focus was somewhat more narrow this time around. And I think it's important when you're auditing an area like Child and Family Services to focus on results, because if you just focus on administrative changes, a lot of administrative changes can be made. And we found in this audit that a lot of changes were made. But unless and until they result in improvements to services on the ground, the deficiencies that we identified the first time around, remain crucial to examine. So the department did some good things in terms of reorganizing accountability, identifying assistant directors in regions to help better monitor what child protection workers are doing on the ground. But unless and until those changes result in improvements to services, our original observations remain. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. So in the, we've heard, there's vacancies. There's a number of vacancies in that. And I've noticed during my term as an MLA that, qualifications seem to be being increased, which then puts more challenges to, fill those positions, i.e. having masters and, degrees in that. Right now, if you have a master's degree, you can write your check and you can go anywhere in the territory. So when you looked at, the audit, this, through the process and the vacancies, was that part of the audit? Was there part of the questions? Was there a recommendation, to be innovative or looking at how, or have you done other audits that have allowed you to, tell departments and governments to be innovative and looking at that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We didn't do a detailed assessment of vacancy for child and family services here in the NWT because we have been looking first and foremost to see whether the department had assessed what was actually needed to deliver on the obligations under the Child and Family Services Act on the ground. So the funding that goes to the authorities to then carry out those responsibilities. Our report does talk a little bit about some of the impacts that are happening because of the vacancies that are in the department, that are in the authorities, in terms of people being overworked and having to take on 3 or 4 different positions. We spoke in particular about that in terms of the quality assurance processes that are supposed to be happening within the department and the backlogs that creates when you've got people within positions who are taking on 3 or 4 different jobs at the same time. To speak to your other question about whether we talk about anything innovative, we did in 2014, I believe, do an audit on child and family services in the Yukon. And as part of that, we did provide some information about some of the innovative work that government was doing to try to attract child protection workers within smaller communities across that territory. So that government did things like offering housing subsidies and higher salaries and things of that nature to try to attract and retain social workers and child protection workers within small communities in that jurisdiction. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate that answer. My next question is right now when children become or the department, brings the children into the system, the department becomes the guardian. And there seems to be a disconnect trying to get information to the parents, the grandparents, family members of these children. And was that part of the audit? Have you looked at that? Because it seems to be a disconnect to me with families. If when we're apprehending children and we're putting them into protection and we're trying to do the well-being of it, but it's also the well-being of the parents or the guardians in that. So have you guys looked at that, or is there some challenges with that being out there? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I might start and ask Ms. Jellinek to add to my response. No, we didn't look explicitly at that particular issue. We looked at information more generally, and we found some areas where it will be incumbent upon the department and the authorities to make improvements. A prime example of that would be in the area of out of territory placements. So when a child is placed outside of the territory because of perhaps complex physical or psychological needs that can't be met within the territory, the department is supposed to ensure that there's a courtesy supervision worker in place from the jurisdiction in the south to monitor how that child is doing, whether it's in the group home or in an institution. And one of the things we found in the audit is that the department didn't always, in fact in the majority of the cases, didn't identify a courtesy supervision worker to monitor that child in the southern institution. So that's an example of where the department didn't have the information that was important for it to monitor how well the child is doing and to take any corrective actions if the information that was being provided suggested that corrective actions be taken. So that's an example of where we found some shortcomings in terms of information that was being collected. Another area that was of some concern to us was in the area of transferring guardianship to other adults when a family would decide that in consultation with the child protection worker that they wanted to transfer guardianship of a child from themselves to a third party, basically. We found that in that case, that was a practice that started to emerge in some of the regions in the period since our 2014 audit. But when we started doing some additional work there, it came to our attention that senior management in the department wasn't aware of this practice occurring. So it points to us of the importance of the department having the systems, doing the monitoring to allow it to be in a position to know what is going on in the regions and what's going on with individual children, so they're in a better position to respond to any concerns that are emerging. And I may ask Ms. Jellinek to add to my responses. She did a lot of detailed work in this area.
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Child and Family Services Act sets out really specific and wide-ranging responsibilities that the department does have for any children that are under their care. However, there's also a lot of provisions within it to involve family members, to ensure communications with biological parents, etc. So they do have a fundamental responsibility to care for and make the decisions that are in the best interest of those children. But I would suggest it would be worth having a conversation with the department as well to figure out how they want those communications exactly to work in situations where the department and the authorities have those parental responsibilities, but biological parents are still wanting to have information. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jellinek. Mr. Thompson, your time's expired. We'll now move on to Ms. Green. Ms. Green, you have the floor.
Thank you. I appreciate you making yourselves available today for our questions. I have some questions around administrative burden. So last time, after the 2014 audit, the department focused a lot of its attention on better reporting. And they introduced some new software and so on. And I'm wondering to what extent these recommendations will add to that administrative load. And if they are going to add to it, how can that be mitigated? Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, in the course of each performance audit that we do, we work closely with the department or the entities being audited to craft our recommendations and have fulsome discussions with officials about how practical and implementable the recommendations are, including additional pressures that might be placed on the system in the course of making those recommendations. So we're confident that by the time we finalize our recommendations and include them in the report, that they will deal with the deficiencies identified. Yes, your point is a valid one that additional requirements or actions may be required responding to our recommendations, but we always go to what is required under the legislation, what is required under the standards. So as legislative auditors, that's our starting point. So when we make recommendations in any area requiring improvement, one of the things we say to departments is that it's incumbent upon them in responding to the recommendations to arrange or rearrange or their resources in a way to allow them to act on the responses. In this audit, as in every audit, we audited compliance against legislation. So I may be repeating myself a bit, but the recommendations that we made are recommendations that we feel are important for the department and the authorities in this case to meet their commitments under the legislation and the recommendations. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for that response. What I'm concerned about is that the department really took a wrong turn in responding to the audit last time in really increasing of its own choice the administrative burden there, and so it seemed as if social workers had less time to spend on their clients because they were spending more time managing the system that the department had put in place. So how can we persuade the department not to go that route again? Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, as we note in our audit report, yes, in response to our 2014 audit, the department and the authorities undertook a lot of changes of an administrative nature, of an accountability nature to respond to our recommendations. But one of the things we found in doing the follow-up is that, in our opinion, they didn't sufficiently think about the resources required to implement the recommendations, and in some cases the recommendations were not fulsomely implemented. And a prime example of that would be the strategic decision-making model, which was intended to help child protection workers on the front line make better decisions in a more timely basis, and therefore provide better services to children. Well, one of the things we learned in this audit is that child protection workers didn't get enough training to allow them to adequately and properly use that new system. And then when the department went and had a quality review done of some of the decisions that were made by child protection workers using that system, they found that the error rate was about 50%. So that points to the importance in making changes for the department and the authorities to efficiently consider the resources required in making them. I do believe that in 2014 the department and the authorities responded in good faith in terms of responding to the recommendations. But going to your question about this time around, I think it will be important as the department presents its action plan and implements its action plan that it ensures that the resources are lined up to follow through on that. And that might be a question that would be important to ask of the department and the authorities this afternoon. And I would also add, and this goes to what we see in many audits and when we do follow-ups, often there's a lot of initial activity when recommendations are made and action plans are put forward, but it will be important for all the parties involved to keep that focus on those changes, not only say for the first 6 months, but for the second 6 months and 18 months out, because these changes and improvements that are required will be difficult to implement. It's a very difficult area in which to deliver programs and services. It will be important for the department and the authorities to put forward a sustained effort to make sure that the commitments that they're making falling out of this audit are actually followed through on in the longer term. And will sound like a broken record as we say this throughout the course of the hearing, but so that those changes made ultimately result in better services to children that are at risk and requiring protection. That's the key. On the ground, ultimately, our services being improved. Mr. Chair.
Ms. Green.
Thank you very much. Of course, that is the focus. One of the responses you got from the department is that they're going to do a system-wide accreditation. And I understand that involves the social services side of the department as well as health. And so I'm wondering if you think that this will be helpful in achieving the recommendations that you've set out here. Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, that was not something that we dealt with in the audit. I understand that's a commitment that's been made in the action plan, so I can't really speak to it specifically, but what I can say generally, based on audits we've done in the area of health and social services, not only federally but or territorially, but federally as well, that process is often very helpful for a system to understand where there may be weaknesses that have to be resolved before the system receives the accreditation. So in our opinion, that would be one of several helpful initiatives or helpful steps that the system could take to ensure that it's meeting all the requirements set out in the legislation and in the standards and procedures, and again, to ensure that ultimately services to children and vulnerable families are being improved. So it's in our opinion, even though we didn't cover it in the audit, it's a useful tool that can be used going forward.
Ms. Green.
Thank you for that opinion. I realize they're very labor intensive, but it's good to hear that they may also be very helpful. So there are 11 recommendations here. They're all important recommendations. But can you give us any sense of the urgency of some versus others, or the priority of some versus others, given the fact that some of them relate more. Well, they all relate to the well-being of children, but some of them are, like the out-of-territory supervision, are more immediate than some of the other ones. So could you give us a sense of the top say 2 or 3 that really we need to take action on them today. Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, I'll may not fulsomely respond to your question. I'll maybe sort of come at it from a bit of a different angle. I think it would be important to think about each of the recommendations in terms of how quickly they could result in improvements to services on the front lines. So you raise a very good example when it comes to out-of-territory placements. That's something from our point of view that doesn't require a huge change to the organization of the department or the system. It doesn't require a huge amount of new resources. It requires identifying someone or some unit within the department to take the lead and make sure that as children are being placed out of territory, that a courtesy supervision worker is identified in each and every case. So that's a sort of recommendation that from our point of view has to be acted on immediately, because kids are at risk in these institutions or in these southern placements if that's not the case. We point to a very blatant example in the audit report of a child or a young person that ran away on several occasions, and because there was not a supervisory worker in place, it was very unclear who was supposed to get that child back into the institution, and there are obvious risks if a child is out on the streets. And there are several other recommendations. Another is in the area of guardianship, where we feel strongly that has to be dealt with very quickly, because once a child is placed into a guardianship arrangement, the Director of Child and Family Services no longer has jurisdiction over that child. So it's incumbent that as the department is considering that option as an element of permanency planning, that the proper checks are done to make sure that the individuals receiving that child have had the background checks done, the police checks, the inspection of the home, etc., to make sure that that child who's being taken from a difficult situation is being put in a situation where the risks are being minimalized. So to respond to your question, we consider all of the recommendations important, but I think those ones where they don't require a significant or a huge change to the structure of the department or the authorities, we would hope could be implemented more quickly. I should also add, and I may have said this already, and I'll certainly say it again, that you're dealing with a situation here where anything less than 100% compliance with the legislation and the standards and the procedures is not acceptable. So I know it's a high bar, but that's what's required in the legislation. So I think everything that's being done, all the actions that are being taken need to be sort of undertaken through that, or considered through that lens. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Ms. Green, your time's expired, so we'll now go to Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. One of the responses that we've heard to the audit was that the department had its own internal audits and processes in place, that they knew that there was problems, but somehow after 4 years things got worse. So what kind of lessons can we learn from that experience, and why did things go so wrong?
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, I might ask Ms. Jellinek to respond to that question.
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there's a couple of things the department really needs to consider in figuring out why, after all these procedural changes, things are in some cases worse. One, as we mentioned in the report, they still haven't assessed whether they have the right number and the right skill sets around the table to provide that fulsome, compliant services to children and their families who are entitled to it under the Child and Family Services Act. I think second, as part of that resource assessment, they need to be looking as part of this audit work, and then the follow-up, the why things aren't being done. Is it because a child protection worker just has too much on their plate and they have to make some really difficult decisions? Is it because the standards aren't clear, there's a misunderstanding, more training is needed? more supports are needed on the ground, et cetera. So I think as part of the department's assessment of figuring out what it needs to deliver, what it's obligated to deliver to families and children in the Northwest Territories, it also needs to think about what supports are needed on the ground and the reasons why behind what hasn't been done up until now. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks. That's very helpful. So we're going to hear now this afternoon from the department, and I think there is a commitment to do some reporting and so on. So do you have any advice or suggestions for us in terms of what we should be looking for to make sure that that feedback loop that you described is actually working? Thanks.
Mr. Wheeler?
Mr. Chair, I think it will be important for the members to be asking the department about, as Ms. Jellinek alluded to or mentioned, there are some quality assurance and monitoring mechanisms in place. So I think it will be important to have assurance that as the department more fulsomely implements those systems, that they've got the resources in place to make sure that they're operating as optimally as possible. And it goes back to the point of doing a fulsome analysis of the resources needed to meet requirements. So I think that will be quite important. But I think it would also be important to the extent that the committee is looking at the department and the authority's action plan to be asking questions about over the longer term, how the committee and I guess the government can have the assurance that the commitments made as part of the action plan in responding to our audit are actually being followed through on a continual basis. Because as is the case for all departments, there's many priorities and many urgencies that the department faces at any one point in time, and as time goes by and new crises emerge, it would be easy to sort of lose sight of some of the issues that this audit and our initial audit in 2014 identified. So I think it's a question of following through on some of the commitments or all of the commitments that are being made in the action plan. And I believe Ms. Jellinek would like to add to that response.
Ms. Jellinek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Something else we talked about in our report is the creation of the NTHSSA and a specific Child and Family Services division within the NTHSSA. We observed that there was a lot of confusion about who was responsible for what. However, the ultimate intent of that division is to be providing that support and consistency to help improve Child and Family Services delivery as well. You know, they told us about some models that they were trying to put in place to improve, to offer more direction on the ground and improve services. Certainly clarifying roles and responsibilities and ultimate accountability and who can provide that type of support on the ground would be another way that they can certainly move the bar forward to and help to provide those types of supports as they move forward in making improvements. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks. I'll yield to my colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Next on my list is Mr. Simpson. You have the floor.
Thank you, and I'm going to talk about what most members have talked about, and that's that implicit in the findings of this report and sometimes explicitly mentioned is a lack of staff to carry out the basic functions of Child and Family Services. You mentioned in the report that some key positions remain vacant for extended periods, requiring some employees to perform the duties of 3 or 4 positions at various times. One specific example is that when the department decided to review whether all health authorities were using the assessment tool properly, it assigned 1 staff member to perform 3,000 required reviews. This is in addition to the person's full-time job. The result is that mistakes using the tool, resulting in things like deciding not to investigate a call, which need to be caught immediately, were only found months later. And I know this is a high-stress field. I know it's difficult to attract people, but all of these vacancies, I'm sure, make it more difficult because people are aware that you don't have the support when you go to work for the health authorities or for the Department of Health and Social Services in this division. So I'll start with the current staffing model. If all the vacancies were filled based on what you observed, would the department and the authorities, in your opinion, have the ability to achieve 100% compliance? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, I would respond to that by saying that we would not know because of a more fundamental issue. And that's that the department, at least when we were doing our audit and when we finished our audit, had not undertaken that fulsome analysis of the resources required, so people and systems and financial, to meet the requirements set out under the legislation and the standards. That was something we recommended the department and the authorities do in our first audit in 2014. In fact, that was something we recommended in an audit back in 2011 on the health system. So I think unless and until the department and the authorities undertake that fulsome analysis, simply looking at vacancy rates and whether they were all filled won't allow you to conclude whether, if they were filled, they would be meeting all the requirements set out in the legislation and in the standards and procedures. It's not an easy field in which to operate. It's a high-stress field. The demands of that profession are quite significant. And I think it's here in the north, it's compounded by issues of distance and smaller communities and communities that are fly-in only. So there are a lot of challenges that need to be considered when the department is trying to identify the resources required to meet those commitments. So before you can get to responding to filling all the vacancies, would that be enough to meet all requirements? That fundamental analysis still needs to be done. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. You also note that the authorities are funded to hire social workers to a level that was determined in 1998, so 20 years ago, and it hasn't been changed since, that's my understanding. So could you talk about how this determination was made, and perhaps if the department could use this to determine current needs? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was an observation we made in our 2014 audit, was that they were funded to 1998 levels. At that time, and here as well, the department was unable to provide us with any evidence of how those original numbers, the funding that goes to the authorities and the number of people that's supposed to fund, were derived. Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler.
And if I could just add to that point, Mr. Chair, it was when we did the examination work, we found some quite significant disparities between regions. So, for example, when we compared the number of files or cases that a child protection worker was responsible for, I believe it was in the Yellowknife region, it was half that was required in one of the more outlying regions. So, obviously, the people in the outlying regions, the child protection workers in those regions, had a lot more on their plate when it came to the number of files they had to manage. And it also extended to things like family preservation workers. We found in 2014 that the Yellowknife Authority had staffed a preservation position in its region, which was intended to alleviate some of the pressures on child protection workers so they could focus more on the work that we're supposed to focus on. This time around, we found that in Yellowknife there were 3 prevention workers, which was a good development, but we found that in the outlying regions, there still were no family preservation workers. So those are 2 sort of concrete examples of where it begs the question of whether, if a detailed assessment of funding requirements was done, if it would identify additional resources to help some of the regions do their work in a more fulsome manner. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So my takeaway from this is that the linchpin of any successful action plan that the department presents would be based on first on the determination of the staffing and resource levels that are required. Do you agree with that assessment? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, that is a fundamental observation and recommendation that we made. I think that is one of the foundations or things going forward that the department and the authorities need to deal with over the shorter term. Unless and until that's done, it makes it very difficult for the system to identify what is actually required for it to meet its commitments. So absolutely, you're correct on that. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. And I believe you spoke of this earlier. They committed to do this work after the 2014 audit. What came of that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, as we note in our audit report, the department commissioned the Child Welfare League to do some preliminary analysis. At one point after we tabled our initial audit, and we do note in the audit report that towards the end of our examination, the department had started to do some of that analysis. However, at the point in time when we finished our examination work, that analysis had been not completed. So that is why we made that conclusion that that work had not been done. It might be important for the committee to ask the department if it's made progress in the period since we finalized our work on doing that fulsome assessment. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the answers. I know that I know what we're going to have to hold their feet to the fire on, and it seems like it's this one issue that they're going to have to build their whole action plan on. So I appreciate your answers and your information. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Nakamayak, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation today. As mentioned earlier, I'm not going to reiterate some of what my colleagues mentioned, but maybe add on to some of what they spoke about. Mr. Chair, it looks like the health system right now seems to be in survival mode, and when you're in survival mode, you can't really take care of your own business. Mind you, something that you're working with in Alberta or Manitoba or Saskatchewan or in other territories. I think maybe all of the red tape and all the policies that are put into place and red tape that are preventing families from getting the proper health care that they need are overburdening the department, and maybe that's a sign that the Child and Family Services needs to move away from health and social services so they can take more action sooner and adequate action to help families. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the achievements in the department or the goals of the department they may be different from what actually families are wanting to achieve in their lives, in their communities. And this speaks to a center of centralization. Over the years, government in Northwest Territory has been becoming more and more centralized into the capital. In a sense, that leaves the smaller communities and some of the regions that are more far-fetched out of getting the proper help that they need. I'm just wondering if this may be a trend that you're seeing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Willie, do you want to comment on that?
Mr. Chair, that's not something that we looked at explicitly in the audit report, but it does relate to an observation that we seem to make in successive reports, and that a lot of the challenges that vulnerable residents face are not single-faceted. For example, if you look at challenges in the area of housing shortages can impact on educational achievement, which can impact on the ability to enter and remain in the labor force. So it points to the importance of looking at the challenges that residents face from a more holistic point of view. And I would ask Ms. Jellinek to comment on this, but we did see in the audit that we just tabled an example when it came to youth where some of that good stuff was starting to happen, and I think it's important for us to, when we're doing these audits, to point out to areas where improvements are required, but also areas where some progress has been made. And I would ask Ms. Jellinek to comment on some of the good work that was done in the area of youth that had been previously aging out of the system.
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, one of the things we do report on here is the use of the extended support services agreements for youth, which is something new from when we did our audit the last time. It's a new provision within the Child and Family Services Act. We ended up looking at 5 youth who have been accessing that assistance, and definitely there were some good news stories there in terms of youth who had used that service or that support to attend post-secondary education or to get housing support or access to basic services, etc. So that was definitely something we saw that was good. I would say that in our review of files as well, we definitely saw work on the part of social workers to try to reach out and assist families where they needed help, like linking to the housing authority on housing arrears and those types of things. So I think the intent of that integrated model that you're talking about is there. Certainly it'd be useful to talk to the department as well as part of its moving forward on the results of this audit, whether any of that is being considered as part of the movement forward as well in dealing with some of the issues we've identified. Thank you.
Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Getting back to that, housing is an issue across the territory, and it leads to the overcrowding and the lack of housing, the people that are on the waiting list. For students who leave the territory or sometimes leave their community to go to college, say here in Yellowknife or in Nunavut and Fort Smith from a smaller community, they lose their seat or their name on the waiting list for housing. And sometimes people wait for years. That the social impacts of that are not really taken in. And that brings to the point where sometimes I've seen in some cases where parents, single parents, have had to give up their children to social services so that they could be fed, so that they could be taken care of, they could even be housed. So the social impacts don't necessarily begin with just health, but it may begin with housing or the Justice Department. And as I mentioned earlier, there are probably, for one child, whether he's 8 to 10 years old or a teenager or maybe an adult out of the system now, there are probably multiple files on that person from each different department, yet they don't coincide. They don't meet together. So that if a decision has to be made on with the Justice Department, and they don't see what the health and what education, culture, employment may have on that individual. So sometimes we're actually, when we're trying to do good for somebody, we're actually doing them bad. I have one of my mentors. I don't know if you heard about the experimental Eskimos in the 60s when they took 3 young kids out of their home communities to Ottawa to go to school to see how they would thrive or struggle, or maybe check what the government's actually doing, so that they become resilient in the region. I think that's still happening today with the department. There are a lot of frontline workers who work hard every day. The department is so massive. We need to really build on the resources that we have and use that as a gauge moving forward, because we're still failing. We're still failing hugely, and it's not just the department. It's actually the government as a whole. We need to collaborate more. Sometimes we look at the bottom line before we look at the well-being of an individual or even a community at times. We're lucky that we haven't been relocated anywhere yet. That might, with climate change, that may happen. But the fact is, right now, we're struggling that, and kids in the system are actually going through that even before us. And whether we like it or not, that's a fact. And I'm just wondering if your point here, talking about children who are put in with families who they don't know. May have not been going through criminal record checks or whatever. Sometimes the solution is in the community with grandparents or relatives. We need to look at those fixes at home before we go outside and put children through the system where they're going to endure a lot of pain and suffering. When you're struggling like that, you're not going to worry about your marks in school. You're not going to worry about your attendance or even how you're dressed sometimes, whether you're dressed adequately for the climate. I'd just like to know what they have to say. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Did you have a question to our witnesses? Yep. Okay.
Mr. Chair, just to respond briefly to that, I think that speaks to a larger issue that we didn't explicitly get at in the audit, but I think merits at least a response, and that's that it's one thing to meet the requirements in the legislation in terms of, say, making sure that the child protection worker visits the child in temporary custody once a month or in permanent custody once a month to make sure that child, is prospering and is developing as would be expected and would be hoped. I think your question goes to a larger issue, which is the audit did not get at, but that's at looking at children in the system and then emerging out of the system more from an outcomes perspective. So the hope being, and Ms. Jellinek alluded to it in her discussion on the extended support services agreements, and that's that, a child emerging out of the system, you would hope that one of the successful outcomes would be a high school diploma, would be, entering mainstream society in terms of, getting a job and keeping a job. And I think probably as the system matures and as the department and authorities work to resolve the current deficiencies, that might be something that the committee may want to turn its attention to in the future. The sort of the longer term outcomes of children that are at risk in entering the system and then exiting the system. Are they exiting in the system in a way that's going to allow them to be full participants in society? Again, Mr. Chair, that was not something that we looked at in the audit, but it's something we've kind of seen in a lot of territorial and federal audits that we've done on social issues. So I just wanted to offer that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Neckback, you have a minute left.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And I'm just thinking, we're all individuals. We all come from communities and, and regional centers. And looking at the red tape and all of this, it's good that we have services in the capital, could lead the way for possible solutions around the territory. I'm just wondering if, looking at maybe possibly contracting some of these services out so that social workers, mental health workers don't have to go through the red tape that other GNWT employees need to go through, and sometimes maybe they're not allowed to follow through with some of the work because of some of the legislation, some of the policies. So, giving an organization maybe more freedom to do what they need to do is ultimately, like, the end goal is to achieve a goal of someone's mental health and making sure they're fed, making sure they're taken care of, making sure they're clothed and warm. Maybe there's opportunities for other options out there rather than just the GNWT. It's not just about the government. Like, there's self-government coming into play with some regions. We need to look at other options. And I'm just wondering what the Auditor General has to say about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler?
I think it's a very relevant point, and perhaps the timing is good for that sort of a discussion, because as the department and the authorities go through and the process of finalizing and implementing their action plan, there may be occasions where it might make sense to, think, quote unquote, out of the box in terms of alternative ways to ensure that kids get the services that they require, vulnerable kids. And we kind of allude to it a little bit in the report where we speak to access to mental health services, where, we saw instances in the across the territory where kids were, based on our review of the file, really did need access to mental health services, were not getting access to those services. But we also saw an example of where one of the authorities took a really innovative approach to trying to identify, schedule, and ensure that the children got access to mental health services. So, I think there are some examples, maybe whenever the department and the authorities are in front of you this afternoon, that might be the example, mental health, where you might be able to ask them some questions about how they plan to continue to think outside the box in terms of ensuring that kids get the services they need. You're right. I mean, in the north, there are challenges that perhaps southern jurisdictions don't face in terms of, isolated communities, flying communities, difficulty attracting and retaining health professionals in these communities, which require that different ways of approaching the problems be considered or pursued. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. McNeely, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming north to review and follow up on this audit here. It could be said here, and thanks to one of my colleagues that showed me an additional audit that could be added to the list. So that audit was done by a consulting firm here in Yellowknife here, dated 2010. So you've got the 2010 document, you've got the 2014 audit, you've got the transitional from the 17th Assembly to the 18th Assembly report, and now you got your current report. So there's enough reports there to give you evidence that there is a huge non-progressing program, if you want to call it that. A lot of the words and dialogue and discussions we've been having on this really brings back me to the residential school days. Being a residential school survivor myself, I can really understand and relate to the children that are taken out of their family home to another home. In all of the cases, we'd like to see the retention plan remain in the community. And by the individual growing up in a traditional cultural environment, retention of that same environment within the community should be first and foremost. During the course of your audit, have you seen evidence of a policy to reflect that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler?
Mr. Chair, the response to that question would be no, and perhaps that might be something you might want to raise with the department this afternoon. But your question does remind me of one of the observations we make on a report, which kind of touch on the issues that you're raising, and that's the issue of permanency planning and case reviews not being done for children in care. I think the intent of the legislation is that for children that are in those vulnerable positions, that consideration be given to if they have to be removed from the home, whether it's on a temporary or a permanent basis, that child protection workers and the system think about ways to ensure that that can be done with the least disruption possible and with a view to the longer term needs of the individual child that's being impacted. And when we did our audit work, we didn't see a lot of that permanency planning taking place. So that probably isn't a solution to all the ills that you raised in your question and your comment. But I think if permanency planning was done as it should be, and the case reviews were done, the quarterly case reviews were done as they should be, that might start to at least get at some of the issues you raised on a going forward basis. Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that reply. I've got several questions, but I'm going to try to keep them to a minimum and go back on the list here so I can give other colleagues time here. But this discussion that you had mentioned in your audit leads me to one of the other questions that I have that I'll jump to. It's the guardianship agreement itself. And whenever you sign an agreement, you want to know your responsibilities and your liabilities before signing on a dotted line. In this case, if the department is soliciting retention with an environment, and in the presentation made on point number 6, if you look at the contents of that, stating that the guardianship agreement in its place, the Director of Child and Family Services no longer has the authority to monitor or oversee the child. Senior department and authority officials told us they were unable, that practice was occurring. So that, could it be made up and incorporated into the agreement? If we identify that as a problem, taking the solutions and incorporating into the actual agreement and making the agreement appropriate for all parties, in particular the children. In your audit, have you reviewed the contents of the guardianship agreement to feel comfortable, it's suitable, in the safeguard of the community, of the individual, and all stakeholders? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, the issue of guardianship agreements was not something we saw in 2014. It's something that emerged based on our review of the files in this current audit. So from our initial selection, we identified 5 files where guardianship agreements were reviewed. And when we looked at how those were pursued, and they were an element of permanency planning, we had some pretty significant concerns. One of them being that the proper checks weren't being done of the homes that these children were being placed in. But another concern that Ms. Jellinek identified in particular was that it was clear to us that the people who were taking on the responsibilities as guardians for these children didn't always fully appreciate what they were signing on to. And I think that was, I think, an issue of some concern to us. And I might ask Ms. Jellinek to just sort of add to that, because she did a detailed review not only of the 5 files included in our initial selection, but because of what she saw, she actually reviewed all guardianship agreements in the territory, so she would be better placed to respond to that question.
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's important for us to clarify, too, when we're talking about guardianship, we're talking about guardianship for children who are under the temporary or permanent care of the director. So under the Child and Family Services Act, the Director of Child and Family Services has all parental rights and responsibilities for the child. The concern we had with this was that there's nothing in the Act and there's no standards and procedures around it. So for instance, if you're going to place a child in foster care, there are certain basic checks that have to be done. These are meant to be permanent agreements where you are transferring all parental responsibilities to a guardian. But there's nothing for child protection workers to follow, no standards, no advice for them to know exactly what type of screening should be done for those guardians. To speak to Mr. Wheeler's point, yes, we definitely saw in a number of cases situations where guardians were signing guardianship agreements without truly understanding what it was that they were signing on for. Are they getting, once the guardianship agreement is signed, there is no more involvement by the director unless that person wants to sign, let's say, something like a voluntary services agreement. But those things are temporary and can end at any time. They are taking on all rights and responsibilities for that child, but for several cases that we looked at, people were signing the agreements were unaware. So to us, it was a big risk for a number of reasons. One, the lack of guidance that there's there for child protection workers to know what to do in those situations to make sure that they're making a decision that's in the best interest of a child. Second, what happens to the child then if the guardianship agreement terminates? If a guardian decides that they can no longer care for the child, then it's unclear what happens to the child after that. So that was something else we were really concerned about, and that's why we wanted to do the more detailed review and to bring it to the attention of the department as soon as possible. Thank you.
Ms. McNeely?
Thank you for that opening the dialogue on the agreement. I think that should be reviewed, and I don't have no idea when these agreements were drafted, but they should be modernized over time. And going to my last question, we have enough evidence here that there's been several reviews and audits going back as far back as 2010. So it should have raised red flags with everybody. Most of us here are a newcomer to this assembly, and we bring fresh ideas, I hope, and fresh energy. And in your audit, after noticing all these different audits and reviews and nothing has been done, have you seen any incorporation within your audit, within the department for a self-evaluation, either at the community, regional, or territorial level? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler?
Mr. Chair, not explicitly, but we did see, efforts on the part of the department and the authorities to put in place a more fulsome quality assurance process. So I know that doesn't really fully respond to your question, but I think a mature quality assurance process, will allow the department and authorities to better monitor whether they're adhering to respecting the requirements set out in legislation. And I would add that might be a question to direct to the department and the authorities this afternoon. And before I would close, I just ask Ms. Jellinek, was there anything that you wanted to add to that question? Because that's a fundamental question and an important one.
Ms. Jellinek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll go back to a previous point we had before, is that if you're going to do the quality assurance work, you need to make sure you have the resources in place to do it. So I would definitely encourage the department, as part of its thinking about the way forward and what it requires, to make sure that it's meeting its obligations. If they are doing annual audits, if they are doing work in the regions more frequently, making sure that you've got the right number of people on the ground to do that work and to provide the supports that may be needed then, if there are deficiencies identified, to identify the reasons why, and then to work with child protection workers to offer them the supports they need to meet the obligations that they're required to meet under the standards and procedures. Thank you.
Ms. Jellinek. Committee, that your time's expired, Mr. McNeely. There's 4 more people on the list, and we're 10 to 12. So to get through this list, we'll probably sit till quarter past 12. Is everyone okay with that? Yeah? Okay. Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to thank the team for coming up here and helping us understand just the nature and scope of the findings that that's before us. My interest is, of course, the well-being of the children and families, and so I wanted to ask a question. It's hard not to be negative and pessimistic in terms of reading these reports. And what I mean by that is that, you know, it's pretty depressing in terms of, you know, seeing the system fail children. And it's, I kind of describe this as not a crisis, but a tragedy that continues today. And it's very sad to actually see and witness that this thing happening. But there has to be a positive. And so I wanted to ask the question whether, you know, there's a positive, perhaps, case of where children are repatriated with their families, you know, with families having their dignity and cultural intact. And children have been taken away for a period of time, but brought back into their communities within their families, brought back to their mom and dads, their grandparents. Surely the system would have to strive for an ideal outcome of that nature. Have we seen any of that within perhaps the period of study that you've carried out? Masi.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, I'll ask Ms. Jellinek to add to my response, but we didn't look at the system from that perspective explicitly in terms of cultural elements per se. Having said that, we did look quite closely at situations where the system identified a child being in need of some protection or some assistance, but where the decision was made that the child could remain in the home. So in those cases, the authority and the parents sign what's called a voluntary services agreement, which typically sets out a number of conditions that need to be respected for the child to remain in the home. On the other hand, when we looked at how those were monitored, we found that they weren't monitored with the frequency and the comprehensiveness that the legislation and the standards and procedures require. So it's a bit of a roundabout answer to your question, but I think if additional emphasis was placed on better monitoring and supporting parents that have signed these voluntary services agreements. So if a condition is that a parent requires counseling to deal with an addiction, then if there can be more effort made to ensure that that parent gets access to that rehabilitation, I think that would help from that respect. But we didn't go any further than that in the audit. I don't know, Ms. Jellinek, was there anything you wanted to add to my response?
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Something else we talk about in this report, and which Mr. Wheeler mentioned earlier, was permanency planning. And I think that's something else that definitely needs improvement. The department had done, we report a review of children who were in temporary and permanent care to see how many of them actually permanency plans. Okay, so what's the end plan for this child? We want to minimize the number of placements. We want to make sure that they end up in the appropriate placements. We want to have an end game for them, and then figure out what we need to do in the interim to support them and to support their families to get there. We did not see a lot of permanency planning in the files that we looked at. I think that's something linked to what you're talking about as well, to try to do what's in the best interest of children and to have a vision for them, and then to be making decisions all along the way that align to the extent possible with that vision, whether it means that, you know, a bit more work is taken to figure out where they need to be placed, etc. But in our view, I think permanency planning would be something else that definitely aligns with some of the concerns that you're raising about you know, the long-term thinking for children's well-being. Thank you.
Mr. Nadley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other aspect of this question, I wanted to also find it could be appropriate that it's directed to the department, and it's understanding the legislation and how it works. It's supposed to, you know, promote the recognition of different cultural values, and so in that instance, was there a role for grandparents and you know, extended families in terms of the care, you know, the well-being of children? Thank you.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, I would defer to perhaps the department responding to that question this afternoon. It wasn't something that we explicitly looked at in the audit.
Ms. Nadley. Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the team once again for conducting your important work. It's been maybe suggested that, we were dealing with a bit of archaic or antiquated legislation. I would like to know, is the legislation or the act itself adequate, satisfactory, as it relates to supporting the standards and procedures that stem from that? I'll start with that question.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, we did not do an assessment of the legislation or the adequacy of the legislation. Generally speaking, when we do performance audits, that's not something that we scope into our work because it's often of a very political, I mean that in a positive way, a political decision that's made to what to include legislation or not. Having said that, in our 2014 audit, we identified a gap in the legislation, and that had to do with youth that were aging out of the system. And we identified it as an issue, and we didn't go so far in 2014 as to recommend that the legislation be changed. What we recommended is that the department deal with that gap, and whether they dealt with it through modifying the legislation or modifying policies and procedures was something that we left to the department and the authorities. So just to circle back to your question, no, we did not assess the adequacy of the legislation. That's not something as performance auditors that we typically assess, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Van Fine.
Okay, thank you for that reply. And then I'm going to make an assumption then that by not identifying any gaps in the 2018 review, then I'm going to say that the legislation or the act kind of just stands as is, and that's fine. What I want to do is move on to priorities for a moment, and that is you've done your work, you've got a number of recommendations, you've identified a number of failures but now the key question remains why. And so one of the things that I would like to ask is, did you discover at any time through your auditing process that resources, be it human, financial, even time, were being allocated to the reorganization of the health authorities, and that could have, may have taken away from the time, human, and financial resources that could have been required to make improvements stemming from the 2014 recommendations? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, we didn't ask that question or set out to ask that question explicitly. Having said that, when we did the audit work, we started, as opposed to 2014, looking at the results first and found that in some cases the results were worse than 2018. So we kind of backed into those issues, asking the why. How could it be that 4 years later we hadn't realized improvements? So one of the things that we observed was that following our 2014 audit, a lot of effort was made to making changes to the system and to the processes within the system, but without sufficient consideration being given to the resources required to put in place those changes. And what happened then is that some of the changes that were being made were not fully or fulsomely implemented. A prime example of that would be the move to the structured decision-making model, a model that was intended to help child protection workers better do their job. What we heard and we saw during the course of the audit is that child protection workers didn't get enough training to allow them to use that model in an optimal manner. And so there are several examples of that. Another example is in the area of establishing assistant directors. And I think when we were observing those things, what we kept coming back to was not having done the fulsome review of the resources required to meet the requirements of the system. So I think, unless and until that analysis is done, it will be very difficult for the department and the authorities to do what they have to do. It's not an easy task. The department has started down that route, but it really has to finish that work, and it has to be a very detailed, may not be the right word, but it has to be a very detailed assessment of what is required for fulfill the requirements set out under the legislation. So I think one of the takeaways from this audit is that that has to be, and Mr. Simpson alluded to it, or more than alluded to it in his question, that has to be one of the very first things that needs to be done in order to ensure that the recommendations we made this time around and the commitments that the department and the authorities are making are fully implemented. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Van Thuyne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate that response. And I also appreciate a comment that you shared earlier, and that is that, if we're to make some improvements and now all of a sudden we get back to where we're at when you do your next audit, we're just back to where we were at 2014. We really haven't succeeded. I don't want that to be an excuse of the department or of the government at that time to say, we've done good. It's by accountability, according to the Act, it's 100% or nothing. So I appreciate that comment. Lastly, we're starting to hear reports that the federal government is going to be drafting legislation as it relates and talking about moving responsibility over to Indigenous governments. The concern, I guess, and this might be a political one that should be asked elsewhere, but I ask because your department makes these observations through all jurisdictions throughout Canada, and I don't think there's anybody that really has a monumentally good program that we should be looking at as it relates to this very difficult file. But the question that will be put upon us is if this is a nationwide failure, and maybe the Fed's taking this approach as some degree of admittance on this. And, what are we doing, or what shall be the responsibilities that this government should be taking as we potentially transfer over responsibility to Indigenous governments? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, that is a very difficult question, and it's one that as legislative auditors we couldn't really stray into because those are political ruminations and policy decisions that are being made at a higher level. But I would say, to the last part of your question, what should GNWT be concerned about? And I think it would be irrespective of the changes that are being, considered or eventually made. It's of paramount importance that whatever they are, result in children that are in danger, children that are requiring protection, are getting the services and the programming that they require to minimize those risks and to ensure that they grow up to be, full participants in society. I think if you take the child first approach, I think, whatever decisions are made have to result in children getting the services they need and not being exposed to undue risks. So I know that's not a fulsome response to your question, and I would just have to say that it's probably a question to be asked of others. But I think at the end of the day, what's happening on the ground is what is most important. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Van Thuyne.
Quickly and lastly is that, my genuine concern, and I think it is for many, is that if we, the territorial government, are going to go through a self-government devolving process, which we are in some jurisdictions in the territory, the question is if we have a continually identified system that fails, how are we going to transfer responsibility successfully over to Indigenous governments when our model seems to time and time again not succeed? So I just put that out more as a comment, and I'll defer to my colleagues for further questions.
Did you want to respond, Mr. Wheeler?
We're fine, thanks.
Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know you said you didn't really look at this, but I know the department is looking at having more family members take on the children, but over the last year here, I've seen there's not adequate resources, especially if one or two of the family members are working. There's maybe for the first month or two, the department will help them, but I have a case here I've been working on for over a year where they just won't provide any services to the grandmother who is, trying to look after the grandchildren, and there's just no resources out there. And it's pretty sad that we're failing those children. The department is not willing to work with them, and, I think that needs to be looked at as well in the next review. Because by rights we should be trying to help those children, and the grandmother is trying to do her best here, and there should be more resources in that field. Is that something you'll look at in the future? Thank you.
Ms. Jellinek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We didn't look exactly at that. However, we do have some observations in our report about the lack of consistency and support for foster parents who are offering those services to children, whether that be extended family members or regular foster parents who aren't related. And we definitely saw a lot of inconsistency in the types of supports that some regions will offer and others won't, such as respite care or paying for non-standardized items. Like we saw instances where some families will be reimbursed for basic things like diapers and formula and stuff, and then other foster parents who try to submit those types of receipts and are told that has to come out of the daily rate that they get for caring for their children. So definitely there is some work to do, and I think the department certainly acknowledges that in their response. The key will be whether they actually do something about it to really make equitable and fair the supports that are offered to foster parents. And I would hope that as part of that they reach out to foster families and parents and coalitions to see what would be useful and then what they're able to do in response. Thank you.
Mr. Blake?
Okay, thank you. The other thing was, none of us want to see anybody in foster care, but do you feel there's adequate resources for the parents? Because, I've seen children in foster care for a number of years, so it kind of makes you ask the question, is there enough resources? Are the parents actually trying to get their children back? So is there enough resources out there, programs for the parents? Thank you.
Ms. Jellinek? Oh, Mr. Wheeler, sorry.
I'll start anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
We didn't explicitly look at that particular issue, kids that are in care and efforts being made to reunite families. We were happy to see, and I think we noted in the audit report that there was an increase in the rate for foster care families to help them deal with the challenges of kids in care. And Ms. Jellinek mentioned that there's still a little bit of variation among regions in terms of the supports provided. So, we would hope that going forward that the department takes more of a lead role and identifies, what is a minimal level of support that's required, and make sure that, there's equity across regions. But based on our audit work, we couldn't go any further than that. Mr. Chair?
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
That's good.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. So finally, I just had a few questions before we wrap up. So the department has said in response to this audit that a great deal of work was being done and has been done to improve the care of children, but it has not been properly documented. So your office was unable to assess it over the course of the audit. How do you respond to that response from the department? Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We go through a very active process as part of the file review to vet our findings with the department and the authorities, and to give them every opportunity to provide us with any information, any evidence, anything to verify whether things were done or not. It's a standard part of our processes. As part of this, we vetted all of our findings, both for foster care and for children's files. And the authorities and the department signed off on the fact that everything that we reported for each individual case was in fact a true reflection of what happened on each of those files.
Thank you for that clarification, Ms. Jellinek. The department has performed, since the audit, since you completed your work on the audit, I suppose, but before it was released, the department has performed their own internal audit of Child and Family Services, and that was completed earlier this year around May. And they say they have taken immediate action since their own internal findings confirm many of the issues that you've raised in your report. Based on the findings of your audit and your awareness of these issues, do you feel that any action taken from that date, or even since the conclusion of your audit, do you feel that any action taken could have meaningfully addressed your recommendations in the short period of time, or changed the overall results of your audit findings? Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, I guess the short answer would be some of those actions that the department is referring to and that the authorities are referring to were initiated as we were finishing our examination work. So they weren't mature enough, so to speak, for us to conclude on whether they had or will have an impact on the delivery of services on the ground. I think the department has made a number of commitments since we've tabled our audit report that if they're fully implemented, can ultimately have an impact on the number or the quality of the services that children are receiving. But we're not in a position, based on how late some of those actions started, to opine either way on impact.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wheeler. So since 2014 and the Building Stronger Families Action Plan, it seems that many of the changes the department has made to its policies and procedures seem more about protecting the government from liability and ensuring we have a kind of robust environment to ensure legal liability is taken into account, rather than improve the practical operations of the field work that goes into the care of children. Do your audit findings conform with this suggestion that most of the work done has been at a higher level and not direct hands-on support for the workers who are doing most of this work? Mr. Wheeler.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. I couldn't speak to the legal liability issue, but whenever we found that the results had not improved and in some cases were worse, we asked ourselves the question why. And yes, the department did a lot of work following our 2014 audit. But it was in the area of governance and accountability, the introduction of a new system, which is important. But I know they did not properly consider the resources required to fully implement those changes, which meant that some of the changes were incompletely put into place, and that came at the expense of services provided to children. And again, the broken record thing, I think it'd be very important this time for a fulsome analysis to be done of resources required to actually meet commitments to ensure that when we would come back again and do another follow-up audit, that the compliance with the legislation has improved. And I know Erin did a lot of work, or Ms. Jellinek did a lot of work in the field, and I think you probably have some things to add to that.
Ms. Jellinek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing I think may be procedural, but the intent is to be really focused on on-the-ground supports, is the introduction of the new SDM tool. That's meant to be a tool to assist child protection workers in standardizing decision-making and taking everyone considering the same suite of issues on safety and risk when you interact with the child. I think the department's end goal is ultimate improvement of their interactions with families as a result of using that tool. What we found was major problems in its implementation, which the department itself knew. They didn't provide enough and the right training to support child protection workers in actually using the tool properly, and their quality assurance functions weren't well resourced in order to give them the information they needed in real time to be able to deal with situations where child protection workers were perhaps struggling in the use of the tool and potentially making wrong decisions. So I think that links more back to the on the ground, but there was a lot of procedural problems around it that then affected its use. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Final question. I've observed that twice your audit process was interrupted to allow your staff to inform the department of serious health and safety concerns around children. You alluded to one of those cases around a child that was there was no monitoring around the out-of-territorial placement home that he was in. And yes, so you had to alert the department to take immediate action. And further, we see in your audit findings that there seems to be an alarming disconnect between what's happening on the ground and what the kind of senior managers or senior officials in the department are aware of. So you made a number of recommendations that address these findings, and I think and the departments agreed with them, so clearly there's awareness of the problem. But how do these findings relate to the 2014 audit? Was there similar disconnect observed previously that was, the department was working on and hasn't come full circle? Or are these new issues that are just coming up now? Mr. Wheeler.
Mr. Chair, the two issues in question, guardianship agreements and out-of-territory placements, they were not issues that emerged in our 2014 based on our review of the selection or the sample of files. They were quote-unquote new issues. And they were both of a significant enough concern to us, as you alluded to. We contacted the department immediately on both of those. The risks were immediate. So, for example, for out-of-territory placements, if children didn't have courtesy supervision workers, there is great risk that, untoward things could happen to kids. And the example we refer to in the chapter of the young person, leaving the facility and being unaccounted for is a prime example of that. So, these were two issues that emerged in the current audit that we felt were of sufficient concern. We couldn't wait till the moment when the audit was tabled on October 23rd to notify the Deputy Minister because these were issues that required, from our point of view, very immediate actions. So that was the reason why as soon as we uncovered those issues in the files, we formally notified the department that these things were being observed and had to be addressed immediately. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. So with that, we'll conclude this portion of our hearings today. We will come back after lunch at 1 o'clock to begin our hearing with witnesses from the Department of Health and Social Services, and committee members will be allowed to put questions before them around the audit. Mr. Wheeler, if you have any closing comments, you may make them.
Mr. Chair, I guess the closing comment I would make is that we just had a very high-level look at the department's action plan in response to our recommendations. There's a lot of commitments made in that action plan that, if implemented, should have an impact on improving the system. But I think it will be incumbent upon, to go back to Mr. Simpson's point, that there be that analysis done of the people and the resources required to implement those changes. If that's not done, I'm afraid that when we would come back and do a follow-up, we might not find a significant improvement to services on the ground. So I would encourage the committee, as they're dealing with the department and the authorities this afternoon, to press home that point that there's going to be a significant attention and resources dedicated to that action plan in order to realize real change in the system. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Thank you, committee members, and thank you to members of the public who joined us today. We are going to take a recess until 1 o'clock. Thank you.